Hey, what's up? I am here today to bring you an Arch Linux walkthrough that is going to teach you hopefully the fundamentals of Linux, more than just going through the Arch Linux installation process, but also talking a little bit about the command line, a little bit about Linux, and helping you if this is your first time installing Linux and you're going straight to Arch, or if you've already tinkered with Linux a little bit but you don't really know what's under the hood. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to first talk a little bit about why somebody would want to use Arch. Then I'm going to just overview the installation process, and then we're going to jump into the installation process. So if you're looking to follow along and install Arch, you're going to want a USB stick or anything that you can flash an ISO file to. You're obviously going to want a computer, and you should have either Ethernet or a Wi-Fi connection. Either will work, but Ethernet would be easier. And you're going to need a drive that you're going to install Arch to. You can either wipe a drive you have, you can use a new blank drive that you want to use, or I'm not going to outline this in this particular video, but I will include commands in the description so that you can install, if you want to, Arch alongside an existing operating system that you have. Alright, so getting started. Why would somebody want to use Arch Linux? Well, there's two main reasons that come to mind for me, and that would be simplicity, as well as the package management system. So, starting with simplicity, when you first install Arch Linux, you're just going to be dropped right into a blank command line. You're going to have your root account, and that's it. So you can really build your system from the ground up as you want it, completely customized, both, over the hood and under the hood. You can have, desktop manager, window manager, whatever. You can also customize all sorts of stuff underneath for a system that's going to run exactly how you want it to run. The package management aspect, Arch Linux has a great package manager called Pacman. It's for binary packages from the official repository, but you also have the Arch user repository, which is a community repository. And that's the AUR over here. And I've also pulled up the mission statement here, and if you wish to read it, you can, but hopefully I've summarized the really important principles that you should probably know if you're looking to use Arch. Now, Arch is a rolling release distribution, so that means you're going to get the bleeding edge builds of new packages. A lot of people say this, is so unstable, it won't work. Things can break, rarely, but if you are maintaining your system and being an active participant in your system, and you learn how to use it, you should have really pretty good stability. It's very rare that I encounter an issue that's, something breaking just randomly, out of the blue sky. So just to get that out of the way if you're worried about stability. Anyways. So I went over the Arch, why you would use Arch a little bit. So we're going to get right into the installation. So giving you an overview of the installation, what are we going to do? So we're going to download and flash the Arch ISO to a USB stick. Then we're actually going to put the USB stick into the computer that we're going to install Arch on. We're going to boot into the ISO. We're going to configure some basic stuff and then partition our disks for a new Linux system. Once we've partitioned our disks, we're going to mount them. We're going to change root into the install after we've installed the kernel via the packstrap command. Once we're in, we will do a little bit more configuration, and once we're done with that, we will reboot and have an Arch Linux system. So let's get started with flashing an ISO to a drive. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this drive in. Actually, before I plug it in, I'm first going to show you a command here to see what drives you have in it, and then I'm going to plug it in and show you how that changes afterwards, just so you can know what drive you're plugging in. And you can follow along on this part. If you are on Windows or Mac OS, what you can do is you can go into the wiki, into the installation guide, and I'm going to have the installation guide up the whole time to help you out here. I would recommend following it along with it if you're not confident in what you're doing. Just that way, if there's something that you're not sure about, you can go and read about it. Anyways, so if you are on Windows or Mac, if you go to this page, there should be, Windows down here. I think Mac is here too. So that way you can flash a drive if you're on Windows or Mac. Obviously, I'm on Linux right now, so I'm just going to be showing you the way to do it on Linux. Anyways, so getting started, I'm going to use the command lsblk to list the block devices, aka the drives that are currently in my system. You can see they're going in alphabetical order here, and we have the drive, and then we have partitions on it. So I'm going to plug this in and then show you how this command changes so we know which drive this is. Alright, so running lsblk again, you're going to see we now have drive SDH, and that is this flash drive. Alright, so where do we go from here? We're going to download the Arch Linux ISO. Now, I have already downloaded it, and I've also flashed this drive just so that I don't have to cut the video in the middle of doing that, because it'll take a minute to do it. But I'm going to run you through as if I was just doing it the first time. So I would download from the magnet link or the torrent link, or any of these mirrors. Go ahead, grab the ISO. It should be about 1.1 gigabytes, I think it was. And I've got it here in downloads. Now, I'm actually going to take a minute to explain to you what these commands are that I'm using, because if you're new to Linux, maybe you haven't really used the command line a lot. If you've already used it, then just bear with me through this. ls command is going to list the content of a directory, so listing my downloads directory, and then after we get what is in my downloads directory, we're going to use this pipe to then grep, which is going to search for the word Arch. So we're listing my downloads and then searching the word Arch, and we have that Arch ISO there. So the next thing we're going to do is actually flash this ISO to the drive. So we're going to do that with a command called dd. However, we're actually going to do that as if we are the administrator account on this computer. You can see I'm currently on my user account, Bread. I'm going to use the command sudo to perform this next command as if I am the root administrator account. If you don't know, the administrator account on Linux is called root, and that's going to have extended access. It's the same as administrator account on any computer where you're going to have more access, so that way I can actually write to this drive. So I'm going to do sudo dd, which is the command we're going to use, block size, bs equals 4 megs, and we're going to do input file, so if equals, we're going to put that ISO as the input file, and then output file is going to be the USB disk here. So it's going to be dev/sdh, and when we're listing block devices here, this is listing devices that are in /dev, and I'm going to get to talking about the directory structure on Linux later. So I'm just going to flash it to the base drive here, SDH. I'm not going to put it on any partitions. Obviously, if you haven't already wiped your drive, wipe your drive. And I'm also going to add a flag here, status equals progress. And that flag is just going to let you watch as it goes, so you can see when it finishes. So if I hadn't already flashed it, I would run that right now. It would take a few minutes. Pretend I just did that. We're going to get out of here, and I'm going to unplug this USB, and I'm going to show you where I will be installing Arch Linux. Got this nice Thinkpad here that I actually picked up for free from the dump. Had to do a little bit of work on it, but it should be fully good to boot now. So what we're going to do, you're going to plug in your USB, power it on. Now if you have another OS on a drive, it might try to boot to that, so just press whatever your BIOS key is, so any of the function keys or delete, and then select the drive so you can get to it. Mine just booted right in since I don't have another OS, and I'm just going to press enter, and this is going to boot. Now as soon as this boots, I'm going to be dropped in as the admin root account on this drive, so on the live ISO that's on this drive, and it's going to be, root at Arch ISO. Now I'm actually going to cut the video because I'm going to SSH from my computer here into this laptop, just so that I can record it without, so you can actually see the screen, see it on the screen here, rather than having to try to, do this or whatever. So I'll cut as soon as this has booted and I'm SSH'd in. Okay, so I have SSH'd in. I am now root at Arch ISO, so it's just showing what's on this computer. And I'm going to go ahead and open the installation guide again and show you the first thing we're going to do once we are in this Arch ISO. So the first thing we're going to do is verify the boot mode. We can set the console keyboard layout first. However, if you're watching this video in English, you're probably not going to need to adjust the layout. If you do, here are the commands to do that. So to verify the boot mode, we are going to see cat, which is outputting what we're putting in here, what the content of this file, FW platform size, would be. And oh no, that file doesn't exist. So when that file doesn't exist, that means that I am using a BIOS-based system, not a UEFI system. If that file exists for you, it will return either 64 or 32. So if the file exists, that means you're using a UEFI system, and then the number that file returns, either 64 or 32, will tell you whether you're using a 64-bit or 32-bit system. Alright, so I am using a BIOS-based system. File that away for the future, since that's going to come back a few commands later. And I'm going to put, if you are on a UEFI system, I will put in the description all of the commands that you're going to need, so that way you can follow along as well, and I'll just let you know when I'm doing a command that's going to differ from the command you would need to do. Okay, so the next two things we're going to do, we need to connect to the internet, and then make sure our system clock is updated and synced with the internet. So to connect to the internet, I'm already connected here since I'm SSH'd in. But ideally, you just have an Ethernet cable you can plug in, and it should be as good as done once you do that. If you don't, you're going to use the utility IWCTL, and that's going to drop you into IWD. What you can do here is device list to show if you have a network card, and then you're going to do, it'll show you what the name is. You're going to put station and the name of the device, scan. That'll show you, that'll allow you to scan for networks. Then you're going to do get networks there, which will show you what available networks. And then you're going to do connect and then the network SSID. Since I'm already connected here, I'm not going to redo that. I'm just going to show you I have a connection with ping-c3archlinux.org. So that's ping 3 times, and I have a connection. I'm getting data back. My connection works. And the reason you would use ping is just to make sure that you did in fact connect and everything is working. And I do want to mention here, when you're in the wiki, hopefully you're following along in the wiki, when you're not sure about something, or, you know, if I said those commands too fast, you can actually open the IWCTL page here and read what you're doing. Because this is going to tell you, for example, if your Wi-Fi adapter is off, it can tell you how to power it on. And there's all sorts of troubleshooting if there's anything that you encounter that I did and it worked for me and it didn't work for you. So I would very much recommend following along and then actually going to the links in the wiki here if there's anything that you don't understand or are having trouble with. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, we're going to use the command timedatectl to update the system clock. Alright, so system clock is synchronized, I'm all good here. Alright, so the next big step here is that we're going to partition the disks for a new Linux installation. So I'm actually going to talk briefly about how Linux partitions work, as well as the main base root file system and what is in that root file system that is unique to Linux, just in case you have not much knowledge of Linux. Now, I'm not saying you need to memorize anything I'm saying here. I just want to give you, a basic overview, so that way when you encounter something later on, maybe you just have a basic knowledge that it exists. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and use the ls command on / here, and you can see this is the root file system on the Arch ISO, because the Arch ISO is just a mini Arch that we're using to install our Arch that's going to go on our drive. So this is the root file system, and these are the directories in the root file system. I'm actually going to go back to my system here that I currently am recording this on, and use the lsblk command again to list the drives, and talk a little bit about how you can see under mount points. This is my main NVMe that's in my PC here, and these are the partitions, and this is where they're mounted currently. So I have the /, which is just the base root of the file system. I have a home partition, which is mounted in root/home, and I'm saying root out, but it's really just /home. I have boot, which is just /boot. It's mounted there. It's a boot partition because this computer here is a UEFI system. And then I have a swap partition, which is not mounted. It's just enabled as swap. So back to the root file system here. I'm just going to go through and just quickly explain some of these directories. I'm not going to go through in huge detail, but I just want you to have like a basic understanding of what's going to be sitting in your root file system. You're not really going to be needing to go in here and mess around with stuff, at least, you know, not as a new user, but hopefully if you have a bit of an understanding of what's there, you'll have a little bit more understanding of how Linux actually works. So I'm going to start with something we already talked about a bit, which was dev here. So it's /dev because that's the root, which is / going to dev. Dev is for devices. So when I'm doing lsblk here, that's showing devices. Now, what is dev doing? It's allowing us to mount those devices that are plugged in as a file system. And it's also putting hardware devices as files so you can load them in and interact with them on your system, if that makes sense. So when we load them in and we want to interact with them, where would we mount them? Well, we would mount them in MNT here, /MNT, and that's, you know, the default mount point that you would mount a new device. All right, what other directories do we have? We have bin, sbin, and lib. So bin and sbin, binary and system binary. That's where binary packages are going to be installed, and then lib and lib64 are going to be libraries. So if you have a Windows background, you might know about Windows DLLs. Library is going to house something similar to that for Linux. All right, so root is actually the home directory for how I was saying root is the admin account on a Linux system. Root here, that's the user directory of that admin account. We have temp. Temp is just for temporary files, and that directory gets reset at reboot. That's just for something the system is temporarily using. We have var. I forget what it stands for. Variable, I think data something. But that's got stuff like logs in it. We have proc, which is going to have system processes. So like if I were to list ls, what's in proc right now, it's just going to be a bunch of PID numbers because this is where you can view what system processes are currently running. You have sys, which is similar to proc, but that's for kernel and hardware processes. You have user, which is user installed applications and libraries. So for example, if you're installing a package locally, that's what's going to go there. What did I miss? Oh, we have etc, and that's going to be for system configuration files, and we're actually going to be using this etc directory a bit later on. We're going to be editing some files in it. Oh, and of course, we have boot and we have home. So boot directory, that's going to house your Linux kernel, as well as your bootloader and the configuration for your bootloader. So that's going to be vital for getting your system to boot. And the final thing is the home directory, which is going to have your user home. So when you make a new user and you have a home directory, you're going to have home / if my username is bread, home / bread. And then after that, you're going to be able to put, you know, all of your user documents, you know, pictures, documents, whatever, as well as local user configuration. And something I do want to mention is that I am going to, if I just go back to my system and do lsblk again here, you'll see I have a separate home partition. And if we actually scroll down in the installation guide, they've got some example layouts for how you could partition your system. There's a few ways to do it. I am going to be doing it a specific way, and I will explain right now that way and why I'm doing that. So I have a separate home partition here. The reason for that, and I think that's something that's very friendly to new users, the reason for that is if you manage to brick your system in however you manage to do that. I mean, I, you know, had lots of fun, and when I first started using Arch, you know, doing all sorts of weird stuff, and then oops, I accidentally, you know, changed the permissions to 666 on everything. You know, all sorts of stuff that it's like if you're just learning Linux, you might make a mistake somewhere, and that's okay. So why do you want a separate home directory? so that way you can quickly and easily reinstall or fix your system without touching your user files. So hopefully that should help you out. And then the last thing to talk about really quickly is swap space. So what is swap space? If you're coming from Windows or Mac, you might not know about it, but swap space is on Linux and then other Unix like systems. You might have heard about it as being sort of an extension of RAM, and that's an okay description of it. So essentially, you probably know how RAM works. If you don't, it's just running memory, random access memory, that's going to be interfacing with your CPU. So that's what is currently up. So when you open a program, that's going into RAM. So what is swap for? Say I have a program open and then, I leave it, it goes inactive. That can go into swap to free up some RAM so I can open another program but still have that first one open. And this is especially going to come in use if you don't have a lot of RAM. This particular machine that I'm on right now has a lot of RAM. I think it's got 64 gigs. This one has only 8 gigs, so if I were trying to run anything that was going to be RAM intensive, swap would really be coming in handy. Especially if you hit the max limit for your RAM, if you have your RAM fully filled. If you didn't have swap, your system would crash. So when you have swap, you can offload a process to swap, so that way you get some RAM back. The other thing that swap is really useful for is if you're planning to hibernate your computer, it's just going to, when you hibernate, take everything that's in RAM and put it onto your swap partition, and then when you turn your computer back on, it'll just take it out of the swap partition, put it back in RAM so you can resume right where you left off. So that is what swap is for. So now that I've explained the partitions a little bit hopefully how Linux works, and you have a basic idea of how it works. Obviously I haven't gone super in depth, but hopefully that's, friendly enough to somebody who doesn't really know much about Linux. We're going to go ahead and start partitioning the disks. So section 1.9 here on the installation guide. So they're saying using fdisk. I'm actually going to use gdisk here since I think that's going to be a little bit easier. First of all, let's list out the devices that are here again. This is SDA, which is where I'm going to be installing Arch Linux today, and this SDB here, that is the ISO flash drive. So I'm going to do gdisk device SDA, and we're going to open gdisk, and we're now in gdisk. So the first thing we can do is P for print, and that's going to print out if you have any active partitions on your drive. Now, I don't have any active partitions because I already wiped this drive. This is a, brand new clean drive ready to install. If you had partitions and you are willing to go ahead and wipe them and get rid of all of the data that you have on them, you would use D, and then it'll just prompt you and ask you what partition number. You can get rid of the partitions as needed, and then you will have, when you use P to print out what partitions you have, it should be blank. So the first thing we're going to do is make a new partition with N. So N for new. Partition number default is going to be 1 since it's the first partition on this drive. And the first sector, the default is 2048. That's going to be the first sector on this drive since that's the first partition. And the last sector, so here's where we're actually going to put in how big we want this partition to be. In my case, and this is going to be something that you can look in the description if you're on a UEFI system, since this can differ for you if you're on a UEFI system. I'm on BIOS, so I'm going to make this a 2 megabyte partition. And this is going to be my BIOS boot partition. And you can put what file system type you would like. I'm going to have mine be EF02, since that's what I need for a BIOS boot partition. Like I said, go in the description if you're on UEFI, and I will put down what you need there. Alright, so if I use P again, wow, we have our first partition. Now, we haven't actually written anything to the disk yet, since we're still in the gdisk program here. Once we're all done making the partitions, we'll use the command W to write everything to the disk. But right now, say I messed this up and I, accidentally made this 2 gigs instead of 2 megs, I would just use D and then delete that and redo it. So next up, we're going to make another partition, and this one's going to be our swap partition. So we're going to do default number 2, default first sector, since it's just going to place it right after the last sector. So you can see the end sector here is 6143. Now we're on 6144 for the next partition. And how big do we want the swap partition to be? So there is a general rule of thumb that's make your swap partition about 1.5 times the amount of RAM you have. So if this machine has 8 gigs, I'm going to make it a 12 gig swap partition, so plus 12G. And I'm going to put 8200 for the swap file system here, but say I didn't know that it was 8200. Well, it says use L to show code, so I'm going to type L. I'm going to type swap, and look at that, we have 8200 for Linux swap. And hopefully that illustrates to you when you don't know what you're doing with the command, if you read through what the command is telling you, it may well tell you what you can do to figure out what you need to be doing. But additionally, we're also going to install command manuals so that you can actually read the man page on all the commands that you're using. And of course, if all else fails, you can go to the Arch wiki, or just search on the web if you're having trouble with anything, or leave a comment on this video. Alright, so 8200 for the swap partition. Get a print again, we have these two partitions. Next partition is going to be the root partition, so default 3, default first sector. And how big do we want the root partition? Well, this is going to depend on A, how much drive space you have, and then B, how many packages you're planning to install. So I don't have a very big drive and I'm not planning to install very many packages, so I'm going to make my root partition 25 gigs. However, if you have a bigger drive or you're planning to install a lot of packages, I would go, if you can afford it, anywhere from 30 to 50 gigs. If you're planning to install a fully featured desktop environment like KDE, I think that's over 10 gigs because all of your packages are going to be installing into the root directory, as I discussed previously. So just keep in mind how many packages you think you'll be installing, and if you have the ability, err on the side of caution, make your root directory bigger if you can. I say that because when I first set up an Arch system, I made it like, 30 gigs, and then, a year later or something, I kind of ran out of space with that. So if you can afford to make it bigger, make it bigger. Anyway, so I'm going to do 25 gigs here for this root partition. Default on that is fine. And we're going to make our final partition, which is our home partition. And that's going to be, as I said previously, where all of our user files are going to be. And we're just going to be able to make that the rest of the disk. So new partition, default is number 4, default's first sector, and actually we're going to also use default last sector since we're going all the way to the end of the disk. And this default code is fine. So now let's print out what we have again. We have our 4 new partitions. So now, if you have done all of this and you're satisfied with it, you can use W and write this to disk. And remember, this is going to erase and repartition your entire disk, so if you are not 100% sure that there is nothing on that disk that you need, take a step back right now and make sure that you have backed up any data, or you're good to clear your disk, or it's a brand new blank disk. Alright, so it's going to warn us again here. Yes, I want to proceed. Alright, and we have just partitioned our drive. So I'm going to do lsblk again. And would you look at that, we now have SDA with SDA 1, 2, 3, and 4, our new partitions. So what is the next step? The next step is going to be actually formatting these partitions for the correct file systems for our new Linux installation here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make an ext4 file system on both root and on home. We're going to make the swap partition into a swap partition. Now on my BIOS partition, that one's actually done since I am doing a BIOS install. If you're on UEFI, you're going to format that differently, and I will put in the description what you need to do for that. So I'm going to use the command make fs, so make file system.ext4 device, and then SDA3, since that's my root partition. And it'll warn you if you previously had a file system on it. Like, even if you wiped your drive, it'll still show, oh, there was a file system on it. That's fine, as long as you're aware that you're wiping your drive. And now I'm going to do the same thing for my home partition. And if you're not aware, in command line, the up arrow is going to recall the last command you did. That's how I go from having nothing to up arrow. That's what I had typed in last. So now I'm going to make ext4 file system for my home partition. This might take a minute or two, so we'll cut it. Alright, so it looks like it has finished formatting that home partition file system. The next thing we're going to do is get our swap partition ready. So we're going to use the command mkswap, so make swap, dev sda2. That's going to go ahead and format it as a swap partition. And now we're actually going to use the command swap on dev sda2, and that's going to enable that as swap. So now when we do lsblk again, you're going to see we have this on and enable to swap. So now I'm actually just going to do fdisk-l just to print out what we have here and just show you these file systems that we've created. So I've got my BIOS boot partition, Linux swap, and 2 Linux file systems all ready to go. So the next step is we're actually going to want to mount the drives. Since we're kind of creating this new Arch system, we're mounting the drives in the order that you would have on an Arch installation. So where are we going to mount? We're going to put it in MNT. If you recall, that's the default mounting directory that you put stuff in. So I'm going to go ahead and mount my root partition, so dev SDA3 in my case, to /MNT. And I'll show you lsblk again one more time for good measure. We just mounted the root partition in MNT. So now I'm going to make a directory mount/home, since that's where I'm going to mount my home partition. And now I'm going to do mount dev SDA4 mount/home. And now if I do lsblk, we have mounted the home partition in mount home. Now if you were on a UEFI system, here is where you would mount your boot partition. I am not mounting my boot partition because I am doing a BIOS install, and the way I'm doing it, I don't need to mount my boot partition. So the next thing we're going to do, because we've gone ahead and mounted our file systems, is we're going to select the mirrors. And the way mirrors work, and I said mirrors previously when I was talking about downloading the Arch ISO, it's just servers around the world that have the files you need, and you want to select the ones closest to you so you get the fastest download speed. So we have a really nice little command to do that automatically for us, and it is called reflector. And I'm going to go ahead and get the command running since it takes a minute, and then I'm going to show you where you would read about this command if you didn't already know it, so that, because that's going to apply to any command that you don't know about, you can read about it on the Arch Wiki. So I'm going to get this command running, so reflector, and then I'm going to put my country is US, so I'm going to look for mirrors in the United States. I'm going to go for the latest 5 mirrors. I'm going to sort them by rate, and I'm going to save it to etc pacman.d /mirror list. Now, when we're saving this etc pacman.d.mirror list, that's actually saving to the etc directory in this drive. Just due to how the Arch install works, it's going to automatically copy that over onto our new system, so we're not going to have to worry about setting the mirrors again for our new system. But just be aware that when I'm doing it, etc pacman.d.mirror list, that's installing to this drive, and it looks like it already finished. But just what I was saying about going, clicking links and going to read about it. So this is going to open reflector. You can read about reflector. You can read the examples of the command if you need to do something differently. See, you can go ahead and read this. You can use the country flag for multiple countries. And this is the beauty of the Arch Wiki. You have great pages that fully explain commands, and you can go through and read and learn from it. And that should help you a lot if you're troubleshooting something and you're not sure what's going wrong. Genuinely try reading the wiki, and try reading it again if you read it and don't understand it. Now I know that's, a classic thing, all of the Arch users are like, read the effing manual, and I don't mean that in like a, oh, you're not reading it well enough way, but genuinely from my own experience, I will, spend hours troubleshooting something and then go back and be like, oh shoot, I just didn't read what was right here, and it told me what was wrong right in front of my face, So just trying to make that, like, saying that now to hopefully save you trouble down the line. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to need to do here is actually install the Linux kernel to the new system. And it's a pretty big step. So we're going to use the command pacstrap -k, and we have that new Linux system. We mounted it at MNT. And we're going to install, as they suggest here, base, Linux, and Linux-firmware. But we're also going to install a few other semi-essential packages that we're going to need as soon as we boot in. I'm going to include just a few more here because if you're new to Linux and new to Arch, you're probably going to want these packages just to help you out. So we're going to want base-devel. So that's going to be some development tools. We're going to want Vim so that we can edit files. We're going to want network manager. Oops. So that way when we boot into our new system, we have the ability to connect to the internet. And we're going to get something else later on, but I'm going to show you that once we're actually in the system. So that way I can show you how the pacman command will work once you're in, or at least changed root into that system. So we're going to go ahead and run this, and this is going to take a few minutes, so I'm just going to cut the video here and I'll be back once it finishes. It'll just depend on your internet speed, how fast it goes. Okay, so it looks like all of our base packages have finished installing, so we now have a Linux kernel on our new drive. So the first thing we're going to do before we actually change root into that new drive, we're going to generate an fstab file. Now that file is going to say, so if I do lsblk again, you see we have these mount points. Now the fstab is going to tell the system on boot, mount these drives to those mount points. And instead of having /mnt, it's just going to be / since it's going to be on the system instead of from the USB drive onto the system. So we're going to use a command called gen fstab, and we're going to use -u. Now why are we using -u? That's for device UUIDs. And if you recall, so we've got SDB, which is this USB drive, but if you recall on my system, it was SDH because I had a million other drives plugged in. So that's why we would use UUIDs. So that way it'll actually identify the drive by its name rather than just by a alphabetical label. So we're going to use gen fstab -u. We're going to use /mnt since that's where we're generating it for, since everything's mounted at mnt right now. And we're going to append that into mount etc and fstab. And now etc is that configuration directory that I was talking about. So it's going to go ahead, and now if we cat out the file, mount etc and fstab, I'll make it a little bit smaller so you can have it all on one line there. We can see we used our UUIDs, we have the correct mount points, and we have the correct file system types. We have read-write on these partitions. Everything looks correct here. At this point, if it wasn't correct, you could go back and make sure you have everything mounted correctly and then regenerate it. Now, if you are on a UEFI system, this is where you're going to be doing something slightly differently, just because you are going to have your BIOS, or not BIOS, but your EFI partition mounted. So you're going to have that in your fstab file as well, so you should have 4 partitions listed here rather than just 3. And I will put that in the description so you remember that. Okay, so we have our fstab file. I'm just going to clear this so we have some space. And the next thing we're going to do, we're actually going to go into our new system. So we're going to do arch-chroot, which is change root, into /mnt. And now it only looks a little bit different, but now we are in our new system. So we are root in the drive that I just installed Arch on. So we have to do a few more configuration things before we're ready to actually reboot and pull out this flash drive. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to set the time zone by making a symbolic link. So ln-sf user share zone info and region city. So I know mine's going to be US Eastern, but if you don't know command line here, so you can use tab to autocomplete something. So if I just type E, it's going to do East. There's a couple East. I'm not in East Indiana, but I am Eastern. So I'm going to do US Eastern. And then that's going into etc local time, with ln-sf being the command to symbolic link that to etc local time. Okay, so now we're going to run HW clock here, and that's going to generate, if I can type it correctly, that is. And then we should have our time zone set up. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go look at localization. And this is somewhere that if you had set your keyboard layout previously, you would set it again in the new system, so you can make it permanent for your new system. Since I didn't do that, I don't need to touch the keyboard layout. However, I will do the localization here. So I'm going to edit, and if you recall, we installed Vim. So that's an editor that we can use to go into etc locale.gen. And I'm just going to teach you in the most basic way how to use Vim so you can edit this. So first of all, you can see we have a ton of locales here. I don't want to scroll all the way down to en_us, so I'm just going to use / and then search. / is allowing me to search in this document here. en_us, it's right there, so I'm going to press enter, and then I'm going to use A so that I can actually just go and edit and remove those. Now I'm going to press escape. You might have to press Control-C, mine might be a little bit different just because I'm SSH'd in. So you might press Control-C, but either Escape or Control-C, and then you're going to do colon and then WQ for write and then quit. And now, next thing we're going to do is we're going to do locale-gen to generate those locales that we just uncommented. Okay, and now we're going to go into locale.conf and we're going to set the correct language variable. And since I have that ability, I'm just going to copy paste it, but make sure, assuming this is your language variable, add this in and make sure you type it correctly. And if this is not the language variable you want, you can open this up and look for the variable that you want. So I'm going to write and quit that. So locale.conf is done. And just to reiterate, cat is going to print out something that we give it. So if we're going to give it the directory etc and then the file locale.conf, and I can tab this file here and tab into that, cat is going to print out what's in that file onto the command line here. So the next thing we're going to do, we are going to define a host name for this new machine. And that host name can really be whatever you want. I would recommend just something easy like, you know, Arch PC, Arch Thinkpad. I'm just going to do Arch Thinkpad. Since we've done a little bit of file editing, I'm going to show you something else, which is we're going to actually echo Arch Thinkpad into the correct file. So into etc hostname. We're going to append that to etc hostname. Now if we cat out etc hostname, Arch Thinkpad. Alright, so the next thing the wiki is talking about is initramfs. That actually gets done when you install the Linux kernel. It might actually, yeah, it was run on installation of the kernel, so it says that you should not need to rerun that, but anytime you update the kernel in the future, it's going to rerun mk-init cpio-p, essentially, and that's going to remake the initramfs. So the next thing we're going to do, we have to do a little bit more configuration, then we're going to finally, at the end, install a bootloader. So the first thing I'm going to do is type password, passwd. That's password, and that's going to let me set a password for my root admin account on this new computer. So I'm going to make it an extremely secure password that you would never guess. And we have updated our password for root. Now, you're obviously not going to be wanting to use this computer as the administrator account. You're going to want to be using it as your user account. So we're going to add a user account, and I'm going to use the command user add -m-g. G is putting in groups. I'm going to put it in wheel and users. And I will probably make a separate video later on explaining some basic stuff about like groups and, you know, some basic commands that you would need in Arch, etc. But I'm going to make my new user. I'm going to call it bread. I've made a new user. Now I'm going to type passwd, and then I'm going to type in my new username. I'm going to set a password for my user account. Obviously, I've used a very secure password that nobody would ever guess, and it definitely was not the word test. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to do systemctl enable network manager. Now, if you recall, we installed network manager when we were doing packstrap. The reason for that was that so that when we next boot into our new system, we can immediately get set up and connect to the internet. So we're just enabling network manager so that that service will start on boot so that we can use it to connect to the internet. Okay, so the final thing we're going to need to do, as it shows here, is install a bootloader. So there are multiple options for a bootloader. I'm going to go with Grub since I think that's the most well-known and simplest bootloader to use here. However, if you are curious and want to read about other bootloaders, I would definitely encourage that. And if you're on UEFI, Refind is a great bootloader. I've used it. LimeMine is great, but I believe it doesn't support ext4 anymore. However, you can go through, you can read about all of these, you can open up Grub to read about it. And this is also something where if you are on UEFI, your commands here are going to differ, and I will put in the description what you're going to need to do. You can also just read it on the wiki here. This is what you would be using if you were on UEFI. However, I am not on UEFI. I'm on BIOS, so I'm going to follow what I need to do for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually install grub. And in this command, so pacman-s, that's what you're going to use to install packages on the new system. Since we're changed root into the system, we're just using the normal pacman command. I'm actually going to install a couple other packages with this that I would recommend you have if you're a new user starting out. So I'm going to install man-pb and man-pages. Those are just going to be manual pages for commands on the system. So that way you can actually type in man and read about the command. So I will, as soon as this downloads here, type in man. So I'm going to type man and then man grub. Oh, grub doesn't have a manual entry. Not everything is going to have a manual entry, but plenty of commands do. Man ls. So here's the manual page for ls, and it's going to show you all about ls, different flags you can use, all sorts of stuff. I'm just using up and down arrow keys to move around. I can use slash to search, just like in Vim. So if I search, I don't know, what's something direct, or... and then I can use N and B to go up and down from those results. Alright, so that's manual pages. We've just installed grub from Pacman, so now we have to actually install grub to our system. So for my BIOS installation here, I'm going to use the command grub-install target equals i386-pc, and I'm going to install it on dev SDA. I am purposely not installing it to a partition, I'm installing it to the full disk in this case. And that's going to take a second, and I'll just cut to when it's done. Okay, great, so grub has installed. Now we're going to generate a config file for grub, which, if you recall when I was talking earlier about the /boot directory, you can have grub there, your grub configuration, and your kernels. What is the config file? The config file is going to say, load these kernels at boot. Show me that this is Arch Linux and we want to load it at boot. So I'm going to use the command grub-mkconfig, make config-o. I'm going to put it in boot /grub/grub.cfg. And that config is going to go ahead and generate there. And once we have done that, we are pretty much ready to boot into our new system. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this Arch change root, since we're still just change rooted in from the USB drive. I'm going to go ahead and exit here. I'm just going to go and unmount, and you actually don't type unmount for whatever reason, it's umount for unmount. So umount -r, so recursively. R is recursively, so that's going to execute it not just on /mnt, but on mount, and then since I also mounted mount/home, it's going to unmount mount/home. umount-r/mnt. Alright, we're unmounted, so I can go ahead and reboot here. So I'm going to type the command reboot. I'm going to pull this up, and I'm going to pull out the flash drive, and if all goes well, we will go ahead and boot right on into grub and then into Arch. Alright, so we're in grub. Arch Linux showed up, you probably can't see it, Arch Linux. I'm going to boot into that, and it is going to load up, and it's going to drop us in at a login prompt. And I'm going to leave you with one more command for this video. I'm going to make a follow-up video to this showing you where to go from here. But as soon as we log in here, I'm going to leave you with one more command, which is going to be nmtui, which is just going to allow you to connect to the internet. Assuming you installed Network Manager and enabled that, that will allow you to connect to the internet. If you're not using Ethernet, of course. So I'm just going to log in with my new user account. Bread at Arch Thinkpad. We have a new Arch Thinkpad ready to go here. So yeah, I can use nmtui to activate a connection. And that is pretty much it for this video. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something, hopefully more about Linux than just about what commands you need to install Arch, since there are a lot of guides already on what commands you need, but hopefully this explained a little bit more about what we're actually doing in that installation process to install Arch on a computer. Like I said, I'm planning to make some follow-up videos to this to explain some more stuff and go into detail on configuring your new Arch installation. I'm sure I've gotten something wrong in this video, so please yell at me at the comments if I got anything wrong. I don't claim to be an expert on anything. And I think that is it. So yeah, I hope this was helpful, and see you next time. Peace.